June 1940. France lay broken. The German army marched through Paris. The tricolor was lowered from government buildings, and in its place, the black, white, red banners of the Reich rippled in the summer wind. For the first time in more than 1,000 years, France's army had been crushed on its own soil. What followed was not just defeat, it was dismemberment. Under the armistice signed at Compiègne on the 22nd of June, 1940, Germany divided France into two zones. The north, including Paris and all Atlantic ports, came under direct German occupation. The south remained free, governed from a spa town few had ever heard of, Vichy. The name would soon become a synonym for betrayal. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of Verdun, accepted leadership of this French state. To many, he symbolized stability. To others, surrender. In his first radio address, he spoke slowly, his voice quivering with both age and authority. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today, the fighting must stop. Millions listened, soldiers in POW camps, families huddled around crackling radios, refugees on country roads. Some wept with relief, others with rage. Petain promised to shield France from worse suffering. He said he would protect the French people while awaiting better days. To the exhausted and terrified, it sounded reasonable. In those first weeks, few understood what collaboration would mean. The Germans demanded food, coal, and labor. Petain's ministers complied. They believed appeasement was patriotism, that obedience would spare France annihilation. But submission is a habit that grows. Soon, German officers were inspecting ministries, dictating decrees, censoring newspapers. In cafes, portraits of Hitler appeared beside those of Petain. The Révolution nationale began a new France, built on obedience, work, family, and faith. Liberté, égalité, fraternité vanished from public buildings. 10 million civilians had fled south before the German advance. Trains overflowed, highways clogged with wagons, bicycles, even prams. Families camped in fields, waiting for news. When the armistice lines hardened, many found themselves stranded workers, separated from their factories, teachers from their schools, Jews from safety. To cross the demarcation line required a German pass and a miracle. For those who reached Vichy territory, the atmosphere felt deceptively calm. Hotels brimmed with bureaucrats. Jazz still played in bars. But behind the facades, France was being remade in Germany's image. The government settled into the Hôtel du Parc. Ministers wandered the corridors in uniforms that seemed borrowed from the last century. They spoke of moral renewal, of ending the decadence of the Third Republic. They blamed defeat on everything except themselves: democracy, Jews, communists, even modern art. Young secretaries typed decrees outlawing Masonic lodges and banning women from certain professions. The past was being rewritten, one signature at a time. Marshal Pétain appeared on balconies, greeted by crowds shouting, "Vive le Maréchal!" His face kindly, tired, grandfatherly stared from posters everywhere. To many rural Frenchmen, he was France itself. But while Petain smiled from photographs, his deputy, Pierre Laval, negotiated in the shadows. Laval was a former socialist turned opportunist, a man who believed survival required submission. In meetings with German envoys, he argued that cooperation would secure France a place in Hitler's new Europe. He once told an aide, "Better to collaborate than to disappear." By late 1940, Laval had convinced Petain to dismiss anti-German ministers and establish full diplomatic relations with Berlin. The line between free and occupied blurred overnight. French police began working with the Gestapo. Refugees were registered, then categorized. The first lists of Jews appeared. Religion returned to prominence under Petain's regime. Priests blessed government parades. Bishops praised the marshal from pulpits. To the church, Vichy promised order after decades of secularism, but not all accepted it. A young priest in Lyon, Abbé Pierre, whispered from his confessional that obedience to evil was sin. Others hid Jews and fugitives in monasteries, turning prayer houses into sanctuaries. Across France, moral lines blurred. To defy the regime risked arrest. To obey it risked the soul. While Petain ruled by decree, a new voice rose from London. On the 18th of June 1940, Charles de Gaulle had spoken through the BBC. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. At first, few heard him, but by 1941, clandestine radios in barns and basements carried his words south across the demarcation line. Students, factory workers, and even former officers began to form small groups: Combat, Liberation, Franc-Tireur. They printed leaflets denouncing Vichy's obedience and urging sabotage. Each act of defiance was a spark in darkness. Meanwhile, Petain called them traitors. He declared de Gaulle a criminal and sentenced him to death in absentia. The irony was unbearable. The government claiming loyalty to France was executing those who fought for her. By 1942, the Germans had grown impatient. Hitler demanded total collaboration, labor, raw materials, and military bases. French industry fed the Reich. French police hunted dissenters. The Free Zone ceased to exist in November 1942, when German troops occupied all of France after the Allied landings in North Africa. Now Vichy was nothing more than an illusion, a puppet dangling from Berlin's string. Marshal Pétain stayed at his desk, still signing papers with a trembling hand. He insisted, "I am protecting the French from the worst." But the worst had already come. For ordinary French citizens, loyalty became a riddle. If you refused to cooperate, you starved. If you cooperated too eagerly, you damned yourself. A farmer who sold food to the Germans kept his village alive. A mayor who denounced communists believed he was preserving order. A policeman who guarded a train thought he was maintaining law, not realizing it carried Jews to Auschwitz. The moral collapse of Vichy was not a single crime, but 1,000 small compromises, each justified in the name of duty, each building a system where obedience itself became treason. That summer marked the turning point. In July 1942, under orders from German SS officers and with the full cooperation of French authorities, Paris police rounded up more than 130,000 Jews, men, women, and children. They were herded into the Velodrome de Hiver, an indoor cycling arena sealed with barbed wire. The stench of fear and heat filled the air. From there, they were deported to Auschwitz. Almost none returned. The operation was planned by Frenchmen, executed by Frenchmen, guarded by Frenchmen. Marshal Pétain knew he did nothing. That silence was the moral death of Vichy. After the Vel de Hive Roundup, resistance spread like wildfire. Railway workers sabotaged lines. Students painted crosses of Lorraine on walls. Even some Vichy officials began passing secrets to London. By 1943, the German occupation was met not with obedience, but quiet rebellion. The same police who once arrested resistors now turned a blind eye. The same bureaucrats who filed deportation lists began losing paperwork by accident. Vichy was rotting from within, but the more its authority decayed, the more brutal it became. Executions multiplied. Propaganda grew shrill. Petain's speeches, once calm, now trembled with paranoia. He still believed he was France, but France had moved on. As the Allies prepared to invade in 1944, Vichy's ministers clung to relevance. Some fled to Sigmaringen in Germany, forming a government in exile under Nazi supervision. Others destroyed documents, hoping to erase their names from history. Pierre Laval still insisted collaboration had saved millions. He would soon face a firing squad. For 4 years, the government in Vichy had tried to balance patriotism with obedience, survival with shame. In the end, it achieved neither. The collapse of the Vichy regime would come not through bombs, but through revelation, through the moment France saw what had been done in her name. And when that day came, loyalty and treason would trade places forever. The tragedy of Vichy was that it pretended to rule while being ruled. To the outside world, Marshal Pétain was head of the French state. He issued decrees, gave speeches, signed laws, but behind every gesture stood a German officer watching, waiting, approving. Berlin had learned a lesson from World War I. It was cheaper to let France govern itself under supervision. The Reich didn't need to occupy every village if the French police would do it for them. In Paris, the German military command in France controlled the northern zone from the Hôtel Majestic. In Vichy, the French bureaucracy managed the southern zone under Petain's seal. Between them stretched a silent highway of telegrams, reports, and orders, all written in impeccable bureaucratic French, all ending with German signatures. It was, as one historian later said, a government of mirrors. Every French decree reflected a German shadow. Pierre Laval, dismissed briefly in 1941 for arrogance and corruption, returned to power the following year at Hitler's demand. He became Petain's chief of government, but in practice, he was the Reichsman in France. He met German envoys almost daily, Otto Abetz from the Foreign Office, and later SS General Karl Oberg, the police czar. Laval flattered them, joked in German, and promised that France would deliver whatever Hitler required. At a cabinet meeting in August 1942, when asked about sending French workers to German factories, Laval said, "I wish for a German victory, because without it, Bolshevism will destroy Europe." Those words would haunt him forever. Vichy was no longer a government trying to survive. It was an accomplice trying to be useful. In the Hôtel du Parc, secretaries typed orders with neutral faces, a decree banning Jewish teachers, a new labor law sending young men to work in German industry, a curfew in Lyon. Each line of text seemed harmless, but behind every comma was a life changed or ended. The Service du Travail, obligatoire, was introduced in 1943. Every French male born between 1920 and 1922 had to report for forced labor in Germany. Those who refused fled into the forests, forming the first large Maquis resistance bands. For every Maquisard hiding in the mountains, the Germans demanded reprisals. Entire villages were burned in retaliation. The collaboration of Vichy thus created the resistance it feared most. One of the regime's most infamous creations was the Milice Française, founded by Joseph Darnand in 1943. It was intended to combat terrorists, the resistance, but quickly became France's Gestapo. The milice hunted Jews, communists, and de Gaulle's supporters. They wore sky-blue uniforms and swore personal loyalty not to France, but to Petain. Darnand himself was a decorated veteran of World War I, once a hero, now a fanatic. When he pledged allegiance to Hitler personally in August 1943, even some in Vichy were shocked. By the war's end, the militia had executed thousands of French civilians. Their names became curses whispered in occupied villages. To Berlin, Vichy was useful but never trusted. Hitler despised Petain's old-world manners and Laval's oily flattery. He tolerated them only as tools of control. The German SS operated freely across France. They coordinated with French police to raid safe houses, seize radios, and deport entire families. At Drancy, near Paris, a former apartment block was turned into a transit camp. From there, more than 70,000 Jews were deported, mostly in French trains, guarded by French gendarmes. When the SS chief Heinrich Himmler visited Paris in 1942, he complimented the French on their efficiency. It was the cruelest praise imaginable. Marshal Pétain remained in Vichy, aging visibly each month. To the Germans, he was a puppet. To many Frenchmen, he was still the savior of Verdun. He rarely spoke without trembling, his once steady hand now barely able to lift a pen. His aides said he lived in a fog of half-truths, believing that by signing decrees he was protecting France from harsher German demands. In truth, his signature had become a stamp of obedience. When news of the WWII Roundup reached him, Petain asked only, "Were the French police in charge?" When told yes, he sighed and said, "Then it was done properly." That moment, small, bureaucratic, emotionless, was the soul of Vichy, moral collapse disguised as administration. While Vichy governed in shadow, another France was rising from the underground. In Lyon, Jean Moulin de Gaulle's envoy united rival movements into the Conseil National de la Résistance. He operated right under Vichy's nose, using forged papers that identified him as a minor civil servant. When the Gestapo finally captured him in 1943, they tortured him for days but never broke him. He died on a train to Germany, refusing to name his comrades. After the war, his ashes were placed in the Pantheon. De Gaulle himself said, "He was the face of France when she had none." By 1943, collaboration wasn't just political, it was economic. Factories in Lyon and Paris built vehicles and weapons for the Wehrmacht. French banks financed German projects. Even luxury houses in Paris made uniforms for the SS elite. Industrialists justified it as survival. They claimed they had no choice. But, after the war, their ledgers would tell another story, of profits doubled under occupation, of contracts signed with swastikas stamped at the bottom. This collaboration wasn't born from ideology, but convenience. Perhaps the most dangerous motive of all. In newsreels, Petain's image still appeared beside that of Hitler and Mussolini. Radio Vichy broadcast soothing voices calling for order and faith in the Marshal. A propaganda poster of 1943 read, "Better hunger than shame, better Petain than chaos." But by then, even farmers in the countryside laughed bitterly at such slogans. Black market networks thrived. German officers bribed officials for supplies. The corruption of the occupation eroded whatever moral ground remained. The young no longer saluted Petain's portrait, they tore it down. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The Allies had landed in North Africa. The Soviets had crushed the Germans at Stalingrad. Every whisper of news from abroad carried hope and fear. In Vichy, panic grew. Laval sought assurances from Berlin that France would not be punished after the war. He knew the regime was collapsing but hoped to negotiate its survival. Hitler ignored him. The Reich no longer needed France's loyalty, only its silence. Inside the government, some ministers began quietly contacting the resistance. Intelligence reports were leaked to London. Secret letters warned Allied agents of German plans. Even within Petain's inner circle, whispers began. When Germany loses, who will save us? Some sought refuge in neutrality, others in hypocrisy. One official described his work as collaboration to save lives. Another called it resistance within collaboration. The historian Julian Jackson later summarized this paradox perfectly. They wanted to collaborate enough to survive, but not enough to be remembered. As German defeats mounted, repression intensified. The Milice hunted partisans across the mountains. They tortured prisoners in cellars, dumped bodies in rivers. In the countryside, villagers whispered names, never loudly, never twice. In February 1944, Milice units, aided by SS troops, massacred 86 civilians at Saint-Sauvant. They burned the village to the ground. Their commander called it an act of patriotism. Each atrocity deepened the regime's isolation. By spring 1944, Petain was a ghost, sitting beneath a portrait of himself, reading speeches written by others, unaware that even his guards no longer believed in him. In August 1944, as Paris rose in liberation, German troops evacuated Vichy's top officials to Germany. They set up a French government in exile in the castle of Sigmaringen, a surreal parody of authority. There, Petain, Laval, and a few hundred collaborators lived under SS protection, pretending to govern a France that no longer existed. They issued decrees no one read, broadcast radio messages no one heard. Food was scarce, tempers short. Laval begged to return to France. Petain refused to speak to him. They had become prisoners of their own choices. When the Allies entered Germany, the Sigmaringen enclave disintegrated overnight. Its ministers scattered like dust in the wind. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Vichy was already a corpse. Its crimes were recorded, its leaders captured. What remained was the reckoning, a nation's attempt to wash the blood from its conscience. But how do you punish treason when half a nation had obeyed it? How do you restore honor after it's been signed away, one decree at a time? Those questions would define the France that rose from the ashes. August 1944, the guns thundered again, but this time they sounded like freedom. Allied columns rolled through the streets of Paris. Crowds surged, waving flags, climbing tanks, kissing soldiers. After 4 years of occupation, the City of Light was alive again. From the Hôtel de Ville, Charles de Gaulle stood tall before the microphones and declared, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." Yet beneath the jubilation ran another current: anger, grief, vengeance. For every flag raised, there was a score to settle. For every collaborator who smiled under Petain's portrait, there were hands now reaching for ropes and rifles. The liberation of France was not only a military triumph, it was a moral reckoning. In the months following liberation, France convulsed in what came to be known as the épuration, the purge. At first, it was spontaneous. Men who had informed for the Germans were dragged into streets and shot. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers, the so-called femmes tendues, had their heads shaved and were paraded through towns to jeering crowds. Photographs from that summer still shock. A young mother clutching her child, her hair shorn, her eyes blank with humiliation. Around her, the same neighbors who once whispered now screamed for justice. It was revenge, yes, but it was also grief finding a target. After years of fear, the people wanted to see guilt punished, however crudely. De Gaulle called it the people's justice. Privately, he feared it was chaos. By autumn 1944, the provisional government sought to restore order. Special tribunals were established across France. The Haute Cour de Justice was tasked with trying ministers and senior officials of Vichy. In total, over 300,000 investigations were opened. About 120,000 trials followed. Some 1,500 people were executed, including writers, policemen, and former ministers. For many French citizens, it was the first time the collaboration they had only heard rumors of became visible in court. Ledgers, orders, telegrams, paper trails of complicity. The bureaucratic tone of those documents chilled the public more than any confession. One decree read simply, "Transit of children to Drancy. Authorized. Signature, René Bousquet." A single line, a single name, and thousands dead. Pierre Laval's trial began in October 1945. He was thinner, pale, defiant. His hair had gone white in prison. He refused to plead guilty, declaring, "I tried to save France by any means I could." The court saw it differently. Witness after witness testified to his cooperation with the Nazis, his personal role in the deportation of Jews, his efforts to send French workers to Germany. When the verdict came death by firing squad, he smirked and said, "At least I die for my country." On the 15th of October 1945, he swallowed cyanide before the executioners could fire. He choked, convulsed, and died painfully. Even in death, he denied France the dignity of a clean end. To many, his suicide symbolized the cowardice of the regime he led. The most dramatic trial was that of Marshal Pétain himself. Once hailed as France's savior of Verdun, now accused as its betrayer of 1,940. In July 1945, he was brought before the High Court in Paris. He was 90 years old, frail, half-deaf, carried in on a stretcher. When asked to stand, he whispered, "I served France as best I could." Prosecutors read aloud the decrees he had signed, laws excluding Jews, agreements with the Reich, and orders to arrest the resistance. Each signature was another wound reopened. Outside, crowds shouted, "Death to the traitor!" Inside, silence fell as he was sentenced to death. De Gaulle intervened. He commuted the sentence to life imprisonment, saying, "France does not execute Verdun." Petain was sent to the island fortress of Île-d'Yeu, off the Atlantic coast, where he died in 1951, a forgotten relic of defeat. His last words, according to a guard, were, "I wanted peace." History answered, "At what cost?" The purge did not stop at politicians. France's literary elite also faced judgment. Robert Brasillach, a gifted journalist turned fascist, propagandist, was sentenced to death for his writings. He had praised the Nazi occupation, denounced Jews, and mocked the resistance. Writers including François Mauriac and Albert Camus pleaded for clemency. De Gaulle refused. On the 6th of February 1945, Brasillach was executed by firing squad. He shouted, "Vive la France!" before the rifles fired. To some, his death was justice. To others, an uncomfortable question. Can words alone be crimes? The same question echoes in France to this day. Hundreds of policemen and administrators faced tribunals. Some confessed, others claimed they had only followed orders. René Bousquet, head of the French police during the war, was initially acquitted in 1949. He argued that he had tried to mitigate German demands, but his name remained tainted. In 1993, decades later, before he could be retried, he was assassinated in his Paris apartment by a lone gunman shouting, "For the children of the Vel de Hiv, the ghosts of Vichy never rested." The femmes tendues, the shaved women, became one of the most haunting symbols of post-war revenge. Over 20,000 women were humiliated publicly. Some had loved German soldiers. Others had simply been accused of it by jealous neighbors. Historians later called it a national ritual of purification. But in truth, it was collective guilt displaced onto the most vulnerable. As one survivor said bitterly, "The men collaborated with their pens. The women paid with their hair." De Gaulle's mission was to rebuild a nation without tearing it apart. He needed justice, but he also needed unity. In his speeches, he spoke of one France, insisting that Vichy was null and void, that the Republic had never ceased to exist. But he knew the truth was more complicated. Half the bureaucracy that now served his government had once served Petain. Pragmatism triumphed over purity. Many minor collaborators kept their posts. Files were quietly closed. France had to move forward, even if it meant forgetting. By the early 1952, the official narrative solidified. Vichy had been an aberration, a handful of traitors who betrayed a fundamentally innocent nation. Schoolbooks glossed over collaboration. Films portrayed France as universally resistant. De Gaulle's myth of unity served reconstruction but buried the truth. For 20 years, silence ruled. Former collaborators re-entered public life. Others vanished into obscurity. The archives stayed closed. Only in the 1972 would France begin to reopen them and face what it had tried to forget. The purge restored legal order, but not moral clarity. Some who had risked their lives for freedom died poor and unrecognized. Some who had served Vichy rebuilt their careers. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre summed it up bitterly in 1947. "We were free, but we had to learn what freedom means after compromise." For a generation, France wrestled with shame in silence. Families avoided the subject. In small towns, old men crossed the street to avoid meeting eyes with those who remembered their wartime loyalties. The nation had survived, but its soul was scarred. Justice after Vichy was never about punishment alone. It was about reclaiming identity. What did it mean to be French after years of submission? What did patriotism mean when both traitors and heroes claimed it? These questions shaped post-war France as much as any constitution. The trial chambers of 1945 were not only courts, they were mirrors held up to a wounded country. And when France looked into that mirror, it saw two faces, Petain and de Gaulle, obedience and defiance, silence and voice, both French, both unforgettable. By 1949, the operation had ended. De Gaulle had resigned, the Cold War had begun, and attention shifted elsewhere. The prisons emptied, the files gathered dust, but memory doesn't obey decrees. The smell of those burning documents lingered, like smoke after a storm. For those who had fought in the shadows, the resistance, the deportees, the orphans, the trials, had not healed the wound. They had merely written its testimony. And so France turned the page, but not the chapter. The question of Vichy, of loyalty and treason, would return again and again. in film, in politics, in conscience. Because the last days of Vichy had not ended in 1944, they had simply gone underground, waiting for memory to catch up. By 1950, the roar of tanks had faded into the hum of reconstruction. France was rebuilding cities, railways, and, above all, its dignity. The rubble was easier to clear than the memories. The war's end had not brought peace of mind. It had brought an unspoken pact. Politicians, priests, businessmen, and families all agreed quietly, instinctively, that Vichy would not be mentioned. The word itself became taboo, spoken only in whispers, often followed by a sigh. C'était une autre époque. For 2 decades, France lived with the comfort of forgetting. De Gaulle's version of history became doctrine. There had been 2 Frances, one false, one true. The false France had been Vichy, illegitimate, servile, void. The true France had lived in London and in the resistance. It was an elegant solution. It allowed the Republic to rise again unsullied, as if Petain's state had been an occupying ghost, not a government of millions. School books taught children that France had resisted from within. Films like La Bataille du Royal showed brave railwaymen sabotaging Nazi trains. The image of collaboration, the files, the camps, the silence, was buried beneath reels of cinematic heroism. The collective amnesia was almost total. For most, it was a relief. For some, it was betrayal. Not everyone could forget. The deportees returning from Auschwitz could not. Neither could the families of the 7,600 French Jews who had vanished in their apartments. Photographs of the lost remained on mantelpieces. Birthdays were still marked for children who never came back. But when survivors spoke, few wanted to listen. Neighbors changed the subject. Publishers declined memoirs. France was tired of guilt. It preferred triumph. One survivor wrote bitterly in 1955, "I came home and found France already cured of a sickness it refused to name." The Cold War provided distraction. Communism, not collaboration, became the threat. Former Vichy officials reinvented themselves as anti-communist patriots. Some even entered new governments, arguing that their wartime obedience had been a shield against Bolshevism all along. The young cared little. They had ration cards to replace with paychecks. France wanted refrigerators, not remembrance. By the late 1952, a generation too young to have fought began asking questions. Among them was a young historian named Robert Paxton, an American studying at Oxford. He found inconsistencies in French archives, laws drafted before German pressure, decrees signed voluntarily. Paxton's later book, Vichy France, Old Guard and New Order, would detonate like a bomb. But before that explosion came a slow leak of truth scholars, journalists, even former officials beginning to admit that collaboration had not been imposed. It had been chosen. The myth of passive obedience began to crack. In 1969, director Marcel Ophuls released Le Chagrin et la Pitié, The Sorrow and the Pity. For the first time on screen, ordinary citizens of Clermont-Ferrand spoke of what they had done or not done under Vichy. Some confessed helping Jews. Others admitted denouncing them. Many simply said they had minded their own business. The film shattered the illusion of a nation of resistors. It was banned from French television for over 10 years. But the silence was broken. Once the camera had listened, France could no longer pretend not to hear itself. In the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, the ghosts of Vichy returned as living men in courtrooms. Each trial reopened wounds thought long scarred. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, was captured in 1983 and tried in 1987. But his trial also implicated the Frenchmen who had served under him. Witness after witness recalled being arrested not by SS men, but by the Milice, speaking French. Then came the case of Paul Touvier, a former Milice officer who had signed execution orders. He hid in monasteries for decades, protected by networks of conservative Catholics who saw him as a victim of communism. When arrested in 1989, he became the first Frenchman convicted of crimes against humanity. These trials proved something the official myth had denied. Vichy's crimes were not abstract. They had names, faces, and French accents. In 1981, François Mitterrand became president. A complex man, he embodied the nation's contradictions. As a young official, he had served briefly under Vichy before joining the resistance. He laid wreaths at both Petain and de Gaulle's graves, an act that infuriated survivors and conservatives alike. He refused to apologize on behalf of France, insisting that the Republic was in exile. Vichy was not France. The debate reignited. Could a nation disown its own history? For the next decade, historians, journalists, and citizens argued on talk shows and in classrooms. The comfortable silence of the 1,950 seconds was gone forever. On the 16th of July, 1995, at a ceremony marking the anniversary of the WWII Roundup, President Jacques Chirac finally said aloud what others had avoided for 50 years. Yes, the criminal folly of the occupier was seconded by the French state. It was the first official acknowledgement that France, not just Germany, had been responsible for deporting its own citizens. The applause was hesitant, then overwhelming. Survivors wept. History, at last, had a witness in power. From that moment, France's relationship with Vichy changed irreversibly. Following Chirac's speech, the government declassified thousands of wartime files. For the first time, the paper trail of collaboration became public. Teachers revised curriculums. Documentaries flooded television. In the dusty folders of ministries, researchers found evidence of how ordinary administration had enabled atrocity. Forms labeled Jewish property transfer complete, requests for deportation trains marked urgent, receipts for barbed wire and ink. It was bureaucracy laid bare as evil in slow motion. By the 2000s, the memory of Vichy had transformed from silence to obsession. Memorials rose in cities once indifferent. Streets were renamed for resistance heroes. Museums displayed children's shoes from the camps. Yet even then, controversy lingered. Some accused the new France of memory inflation, of rewriting patriotism as guilt. Others argued that remembrance was the only path to honesty. Every July, when bells ring to mark the WWII anniversary, the nation still pauses between pride and shame. The grandchildren of collaborators and resistors now sit together in classrooms. They debate what their ancestors did and what they might have done themselves. Teachers describe it not as history, but as inheritance, because Vichy was not only about ideology, it was about choices. And every generation faces its own test of conscience. In small towns, plaques list names of deported families beside those of resistance fighters. Sometimes the same surname appears on both sides. That is France's truth. The line between loyalty and betrayal ran through every village, every home, every heart. As the last deportees and maquisards grew old, they turned memory into legacy. One survivor, Simone Veil, who later became president of the European Parliament, told school children, "Remember that the Republic died not from bombs, but from indifference." Her words became a lesson engraved on classrooms and monuments. When she was buried in the Pantheon in 2018, her coffin draped in blue, white, and red, the bells tolled for all those who had been erased by silence. Modern France does not excuse Vichy, nor does it let it define the nation. Instead, it treats it as a warning of how fear can twist patriotism into obedience. Presidents now attend both resistance commemorations and deportation memorials. School children visit Drancy as routinely as Verdun. The republic that once denied its guilt now guards its memory fiercely. The long shadow of Vichy has not disappeared, but it has lightened, because the act of remembrance is itself resistance to forgetting. In the archives of the Ministry of the Interior, there remains a single sheet of paper dated July 1942. It bears the looping signature of a civil servant approving the transfer of foreign Jewish minors. The ink has faded, the words remain. That same ministry now funds Holocaust education. The desk where the order was signed stands in a museum behind glass. History has not forgiven, but it has learned to look itself in the eye. And in that reflection lies France's redemption, not the purity of resistance, but the courage of remembrance. 70 years after the armistice at Compiègne, France still walks through its history as if through a minefield. Every debate about identity, loyalty, or migration inevitably touches the ghost of Vichy. The questions that tormented 1940, what is France? Who speaks for her? What does patriotism mean? Still echo beneath the Republic's surface. In cafes and classrooms, in politics and art, the conversation continues, not about tanks or battles, but about conscience. Because forgetting, as France learned, comes at a cost. Modern French politics often flirts with memory, whether it wants to or not. Far-right movements invoke Petain's national renewal rhetoric without naming him. Slogans like travail, famille, patrie, work, family, fatherland reappear in campaign speeches, stripped of their wartime origins, but not their undertones. In 2015, a regional politician sparked outrage by claiming that Petain had protected French Jews. Historians, survivors, and ordinary citizens denounced the remark as revisionism. Yet the debate filled television screens for days. For some, it was evidence that the ghost of collaboration still haunts the national vocabulary. For others, it proved that Vichy, though condemned, remains a mirror in which France still studies itself. Successive presidents have wrestled with how to balance remembrance and pride. Chirac's 1,995 acknowledgement of state guilt was monumental, but his successors faced the delicate task of living with that truth. Nicolas Sarkozy, in 2007, invoked the resistance as the moral foundation of the Republic, but avoided Vichy's deeper wounds. François Hollande attended Holocaust commemorations, but urged unity over guilt. Emmanuel Macron, born decades after the war, represents a generation that views Vichy as history, yet he too must speak its name whenever anti-Semitism or nationalism rises. In 2017, when a far-right candidate again questioned France's role in the deportations, Macron replied sharply, "It was indeed France that organized it. That is our reality, and that is our honor, because we no longer lie about it." In that single sentence lay the transformation of an entire nation. Shame turned into vigilance. Films, novels, and art have done what tribunals could not. They have taught empathy. From Louis Malle's Au revoir les enfants to Claude Berry's Lucie Aubrac, the screen became France's conscience. Each film peeled another layer of denial, showing the war not as glory, but as gray. Love under occupation, compromise as survival, bravery as lonely defiance. Museums across France now feature sections dedicated to the dark years. Visitors read deportation lists, hear recorded testimonies, and stand in the France. Rooms lined with confiscated family photographs. Children who once studied Napoleon now write essays about Jean Moulin and Simone Weil. The face of resistance has replaced the face of the marshal. For decades, French culture celebrated the resistance as pure heroism. But modern historians have humanized it not to diminish courage, but to show its cost. Resistance fighters were not born fearless. They were frightened citizens who decided one day that fear itself was worse than risk. In contrast, the collaborationist narrative has become a warning. How easily decency can erode under the guise of duty. This moral tension now defines French storytelling, from literature to theater. Every generation retells the story differently. Yet the lesson remains the same. Freedom is fragile when obedience feels safer. In recent years, waves of immigration and social tension have revived uncomfortable echoes of the past. Populist politicians warn of foreign infiltration, lost values, and cultural decline. To historians, the language feels familiar, the same rhetoric once used by Vichy to justify exclusion. In 2021, a Paris newspaper ran the headline, "France divided again. Old words, new enemies." Editorials compared modern xenophobia to the propaganda of 1941. The difference today is that the public recognizes the pattern. When political slogans veer toward the language of purity or fear, commentators invoke the word Vichy like a flare in darkness, a reminder of where that road leads. Vichy has become France's built-in alarm system. The lessons of the occupation reshaped French justice permanently. Post-war constitutions enshrined stronger protections for civil rights and judicial independence to prevent the kind of legal obedience that once enabled tyranny. In 1990, France passed the Gay-Sot Act, criminalizing Holocaust denial. It was more than legislation. It was a declaration that some truths are the foundation stones of democracy. The same state that once stamped deportation orders now prosecutes those who deny their existence. That inversion, from complicity to guardianship, is one of France's quiet triumphs. For many families, the war never ended. It merely changed generations. Grandchildren still open old drawers and find letters, medals, or ration cards, relics of choices their grandparents never spoke of. In one home in Dijon, a young man discovered his grandfather's Milice badge beside a resistance armband. He said in an interview, "He fought for both sides, maybe for survival, maybe for fear. I don't judge him, but I can't stop thinking about it." That uncertainty, the inability to judge absolutely, is what keeps the memory alive. Because the story of Vichy was never about monsters and heroes. It was about people who woke up each morning trying to survive. And that makes it timeless. France now teaches Vichy not as an embarrassment, but as a warning. Every student studies the laws of 1940, the WWII, and the words of those who resisted. They learn that evil can wear a bureaucrat's smile, that loyalty without morality becomes servitude. At the Shoah Memorial in Paris, a teacher tells her class, "You are not responsible for what they did, but you are responsible for what you choose to remember." The children listen, their notebooks open, the past no longer foreign to them. Vichy's story has transcended borders. In universities from Tokyo to Toronto, it is studied as a case study in moral collapse, how democracy can surrender from within, not by invasion, but by consent. French historians often remind the world that Vichy was not uniquely French. Every society contains the seeds of submission, fear, pride, obedience. Vichy simply revealed how easily those seeds can bloom when watered by defeat. That's why the memory matters far beyond France. It's a mirror every democracy must hold up to itself. In the 21st century, remembrance itself has become an act of resistance. When neo-Nazi graffiti appears on a memorial, citizens repaint it by dawn. When anti-Semitic attacks shock the nation, memorials fill with candles and flags. The act of remembering has replaced the act of revenge. It is quieter, but stronger. The same land that once hosted the WWII now hosts the Drancy Shoah Memorial, visited by presidents, rabbis, imams, and priests alike. The message carved on its wall is simple: to forget would be to betray. As the last witnesses die, France faces a new challenge: keeping memory alive without the voices that lived it. Digital archives, documentaries, and AI restorations now preserve testimonies that would otherwise vanish. One project, Les Voix de la Mémoire, digitally recreates survivor interviews for future classrooms. Students can ask questions. The holographic figures answer in real time. Technology, once the tool of dehumanization, now serves remembrance. The ghosts of Vichy have become teachers. The story of Vichy is not just about collaboration. It is about how easily nations trade liberty for comfort, conscience for stability, memory for peace of mind. Forgetting might have spared France some pain, but it would have cost her soul. By remembering, she rebuilt not only her history, but her humanity. On the wall of the French National Archives hangs a quote from historian Pierre Vidal-Naquet: "A country is not judged by the crimes of its past, but by its willingness to confront them." France confronted hers late, painfully, but honestly, and that is why the Republic still stands, its tricolor fluttering not only as a flag of victory, but of vigilance. 80 years after Marshal Pétain signed the armistice, the century that began in humiliation has ended in reflection. The uniforms have faded, the witnesses are gone, but the questions remain. They hang in the French air like the toll of a bell that never quite stops ringing. What does loyalty mean? What does patriotism owe to truth? And how does a nation forgive itself without forgetting? On the windswept island of Île-Dieu, gulls wheel over the ruined fortress where Petain died in 1951. His grave is modest, a white cross, a single word, Maréchal. Each year, a few still come, leaving flowers or arguments. Across the sea in Paris, at Les Invalides, de Gaulle's words are carved in marble. France cannot be France without greatness. Between the two men lies the moral landscape of the 20th century, obedience on one shore, defiance on the other. For decades, France tried to choose between them. Now it simply remembers both. No tribunal could ever deliver the final judgment on Vichy. History itself became the court. Every generation has reopened the case, historians as prosecutors, artists as witnesses, citizens as jurors. The evidence is complete. The decrees, the trains, the silences. Yet the verdict is not only condemnation, it is understanding. Because to understand how France fell is to understand how easily any democracy can. The files preserved in the National Archives are not relics, they are mirrors. Each signature says, "This happened once," because men believed they had no choice. Out of that mirror rose a new kind of patriotism. The resistance had fought for freedom. Post-war, France learned to fight for memory. The French Republic that emerged after 1945 bound its legitimacy not to conquest but to conscience. Its constitution promised liberty, equality, and fraternity for all, without the footnotes that once excluded millions. When French jets carry humanitarian aid, when soldiers deploy under the tricolor in defense of human rights, there is an echo of penance within pride. It says, "Never again in our name." The architects of modern Europe, Schumann, Monet, de Gasperi, were men who had watched their nations crumble under fascism. They built the European Union as a moral project as much as an economic one, to make another Vichy impossible. France's insistence on human rights clauses in every European treaty is the quiet legacy of 1940. Integration, cooperation, and law replaced obedience, isolation, and fear. The same bureaucratic precision that once filled deportation forms now fills pages of rights charters. Paper redeemed itself. Every year, schoolchildren travel to Drancy, Oradour-sur-Glane, and Lyon's Montluc prison. They walk through empty classrooms, burned churches, and cracked cell doors. Guides tell them not just what happened, but who decided it. At the memorial to the deported on the Seine, the last survivors sit before microphones and speak to rooms of silence. Their voices tremble, not from age, but from the weight of being the final witnesses. One woman ends her talk the same way each time. "You are the judges now. The verdict belongs to you." Modern France continues to test the lessons of Vichy whenever fear returns: terrorism, pandemics, populism. Each crisis tempts citizens to trade liberty for security, unity for exclusion, and each time, historians remind the nation of 1940, when the same bargain was offered and accepted. The strength of the Republic today lies not in perfection, but in awareness. To remember its own fall is to stay upright. Not all who served Vichy were monsters. Many were ordinary, frightened, trying to feed families in extraordinary times. To understand that is not to absolve them, but to reclaim their humanity, because evil done by humans can be prevented by humans. France has moved from vengeance to empathy, from denial to instruction. The archives are open, the memorials built, the textbooks honest. That is redemption, not purity restored, but clarity achieved. Other nations study France's journey as a map of reconciliation. Germany sees in it a partner in remorse. Italy sees the dangers of nostalgia. New democracies see the cost of silence. When international leaders gather in, Normandy, each June, they stand on beaches once red with blood and hear French and German anthems played together. The war that began in betrayal ends in harmony. That, too, is part of Vichy's verdict. The understanding that nations, like people, are capable of growth after guilt. Perhaps the deepest legacy of Vichy lies in the relationship between citizen and government. It proved that legality and morality are not the same thing, that a state can pass laws and still betray justice. Modern France teaches civil disobedience not as rebellion but as duty. When students march for climate, when journalists expose corruption, they invoke a heritage born from those who once refused to salute the wrong flag. The Republic's true heirs are not the obedient, but the awake. On national television each July 16, the president stands at the site of the Vel d'Hiv and repeats a ritual phrase: France remembers, France confesses, France commits. Behind him, children read aloud the names of the deported. Their voices blend with the hum of traffic, the sound of modern life, continuing proof that remembrance need not halt progress. In that moment, Vichy ceases to be a wound. It becomes a warning light, glowing steadily to guide the way forward. The Vichy century, as some historians call it, lasted far longer than the regime itself. Its 1500 days of existence cast 50 years of shadow. But every shadow requires light, and France has learned to keep the lamp lit. The verdict is not guilty or innocent. It is aware. A nation once divided between obedience and rebellion has discovered that democracy survives only when citizens question power, even their own heroes. That is the moral inheritance of Vichy, the knowledge that freedom depends less on courage in battle than on conscience in peace. In the archives of the Hôtel du Parc, curators keep Petain's desk polished, its blotter untouched. On it lies his final decree, unsigned. Next to it, under glass, rests another document, the 1946 Constitution of the Fourth Republic, signed by de Gaulle's government. 2 sheets of paper, side by side, one ending a nation's honor, the other restoring it. Visitors lean close to read the faded ink and the bold new seal. They leave in silence, aware that both documents belong to the same France, because redemption, like guilt, is national property. From the ashes of Vichy rose a republic that understands itself not through perfection, but through penance. France's greatness today lies in her ability to remember when she was small. The last words belong not to politicians, but to a survivor interviewed in 1995. She said, "We waited 50 years for France to say what we already knew, that she was human, and that, finally, was the verdict."